But what I really want to dive into in this segment is the politics of corn. I mean, it sounds kind of absurd, but the politics of corn, because this is why you can trace back every problem to nutritional deficits and the exorbitant prices of healthy foods in regards to fast food to this one issue, and that's the politics of corn. And this is when I previewed this segment, I talked about how the government subsidizing agribusiness is the biggest problem that no one knows about. So I want to make sure I detail this ultra, clearly. So every year, billions of your tax dollars go to farms that plant corn because it's a cheap alternative. We talked about ethanol earlier with alcohol. Believe it or not, instead of gas or oil, people are making ethanol with corn. People are making your alcohol with corn because it's a cheap alternative. And since the 70s, the government policy has been to keep corn prices as low as possible. The government will tell farmers it will pay them for all the corn they can grow. And if you understand the laws of supply and demand in economics, the more corn that's being grown, the cheaper it is. And since there's, as I mentioned, 100,000 uses for corn, it benefits the government and benefits consumers on the surface to have lots of cheap corn available. But here's the unintended consequence. The government is going to subsidize corn, in order to keep the supply high or keep the supply ahead of the demand. But that doesn't help small farmers because lower corn prices end up driving them out of business the same way that Amazon's prices drive small bookstores or, store chains out of business. Small family farms in Iowa and Missouri, they can't compete with these large industrial corn farms that the government is subsidizing. So because you have 13 billion bushels of corn being produced every year, the supply is far greater than the demand. Essentially, we need to find uses for this corn because we have so much. It reminds me of back in Germany, there was like hyperinflation. I think it was between World War I and World War II, and money, or maybe it was after World War II. There was so much money. The value of currency in Germany was so worthless that people had wheelbarrows just filled with German dollars. Kids were just burning it and burying it because it just didn't have a lot of value. And that's almost what corn is. We have so much supply of corn that's greater than demand. We have corn coming out of our asses, literally and figuratively. And so these huge industrial companies that you probably haven't heard of, you probably haven't heard of Cargill, you probably haven't heard of ADM, they're buying all this corn and they're selling it cheap to food companies like Coca-Cola and McDonald's. What are these companies doing? They're profiting like crazy off this. They're buying corn ultra cheap from Cargill and ADM, the government's subsidizing it, and they're turning it into soft drinks and chicken nuggets and burgers that they can then sell cheap and get rich off their asses. So you could argue that the government subsidizing corn is the biggest problem in America because it's the root cause of the pricing system where you're able to purchase these products made from corn, like the soft drinks and the chicken nuggets that I mentioned come from the high fructose corn syrup and all those corn ingredients, and you can purchase them very cheap. And it's really frustrating and it's perplexing because most people aren't aware of this. And I mentioned, just to hit you with some numbers that Pollen details, of the 13 billion bushels of corn that were produced back in 2007, according to the USDA Economic Research Service, 24% were turned into fuel, 19% were exported, 4% were, high fructose corn syrup, 6% were other processed food, and that leaves almost half missing, about 47%. Where does that 47% go? That goes to animal feed. And this is the part where a discussion of corn gets a little bit depressing. But I do need to share with you guys what happens to the animals, on these industrial farms. And of course, you can read Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma and see for yourself. But essentially, the way it works is cows and chickens were raised to eat grass. That's the way that evolution has made them. But because corn is so cheap to buy, and I mentioned the supply greatly outweighs the demand, farmers are feeding animals. They're forcing animals who don't normally eat corn to eat it. Cats are being fattened with enormous amounts of corn rather than grass. Which, it's problematic because when a cow eats grass, Cows and grass have a symbiotic relationship. The cow chews on the grass, and in exchange, the cow protects the grass by eating young trees and shrubs that might compete with it. The cow also spreads the grass seed, so it's planting it with its hooves and fertilizing it with its manure. But economically, it doesn't make sense to feed these animals grass. They're forcing cows to eat corn, not only because it's cheaper, but because it's quicker too. If a cow's fed grass, it takes far longer to grow in size than if it was raised on corn. Not to mention, not just corn, also the food supplements and drugs. That's another conversation. So the issue facing us as humans, because we're eating, these animals, is corn-fed beef healthy for us to eat compared to grass-fed beef? And the issue is corn-fed beef, guys, it's bad for you. I mean, beef in general, too much red meat, everybody knows too much red meat is bad, but corn-fed beef contains more saturated fat and is more closely linked to heart disease. It doesn't have those good fats, omega-3 fatty acids that are in grass-fed beef. Feeding cows corn is not just worse for animals, it's worse for us too. And nowadays you see, with the hypervigilance of Americans, a lot of people eating more organic vegetables, eating free-range chickens. A lot of people are eating grass-fed beef. Some people, know why they're eating. A lot of people just eat grass-fed beef just because, this is the thing to do. But some people actually know why grass-fed beef is better than corn-fed beef. But you can't fault the farmers. I don't want you guys to listen to this segment and say, the farmers on these industrial farms are at fault because, they're deliberately feeding corn in order to profit off of it. I mean, could you blame them? The farmers do it because economically, it makes sense. The government is making it sensible by subsidizing corn for them to feed all this excess corn to their animals. But they're not subsidizing carrots. They're not subsidizing spinach or asparagus or string beans. They subsidize the corn. As I mentioned, it gets bought by the large industrial farms like Cargill and ADM. The smaller farms, the family farms, those go out of business. The industrial farms sell it to the cheap food companies who then profit. It's a vicious cycle. And ultimately, people suffer. And it is an interesting dichotomy that this whole thing presents here, you guys. Because, one part of the government, I mentioned a few episodes ago, we talked about fiber. I mentioned choosemyplate.org. One part of the government puts out an infographic that says you have to eat a balanced meal, 25% meat, 25% grain, and 50% fruits and vegetables. That's one part of the government. And the other part of the government is making it cheaper for you to eat sweets. The government is actually making it cheaper for you to eat at McDonald's. By the way, I don't mean to just like Wendy's, Taco Bell, Burger King. Makes it cheaper for you to eat fast food than to buy green vegetables. So this is something you guys really need to think about. And they say like vote with your wallet, support companies that endorse political policies, social policies you agree with. You could absolutely make buying decisions, consuming decisions based on these principles. And a lot of people do not know about this. They don't know about the prevalence of corn. They don't know about how government subsidizing agribusiness creates this vicious cycle. So not only do I recommend you share this with friends and family, but read Michael Pollan's books. He wrote The Omnivore's Dilemma, where he goes into much more detail on the topic.